Thank you so much. We want to have everyone come on in. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Sarah McBride. I'm the National Press Secretary at the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization. I want to begin by thanking all of the incredible advocates I have behind me right here, our coalition pushing for the Equality Act, and of course want to thank Representative Gay Scanlon for her allyship and her leadership in support of equality. Tomorrow, when the Equality Act comes before the House Judiciary Committee, we take an important step toward equality as Congress holds the first hearing in history on a comprehensive LGBTQ civil rights bill. Despite our progress as a nation, the disturbing and dangerous reality remains that in a majority of states and at the federal level, LGBTQ people are still denied clear and equal protections from discrimination throughout daily life. In 30 states, LGBTQ people are still at risk of being fired from their job, denied housing, or refused services simply because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. For far too many LGBTQ people, this discrimination and mistreatment isn't just a risk, it's an everyday reality. 2/3 of LGBTQ people report discrimination in their lives. Over the last 5 years, at least 130 transgender people, mostly transgender women of color, have been killed, often in circumstances where they've been pushed out of work, denied housing, and refused access to public spaces because of prejudice and discrimination. We see LGBTQ people and families denied housing, people like Mary Walsh and Beverly Nance who were denied a home at a retirement community because of their sexual orientation. No one's rights should depend on the zip code they live in or which side of a state line they work on. Every person in every corner of this country should be treated with dignity and fairness. That simple but profound principle is at the heart of the Equality Act. It is past time that we finally add sexual orientation and gender identity to our nation's non-discrimination laws, while enhancing and expanding protections for people of color, women, and people of faith. This common sense legislation is supported by an unprecedented and diverse coalition of support, including more than 280 co-sponsors in the House and the Senate, the most ever for an LGBTQ rights bill. More than 160 leading businesses, more than 250 medical, child welfare, religious, and social justice organizations, and growing majorities of Americans of every political party and in every state support the Equality Act. The proudest moments in our history as a nation are the moments when we've expanded the circle of opportunity and broadened our understanding of we the people. From Stonewall 50 years ago this June to the steps of the Supreme Court to Capitol Hill tomorrow, we as a diverse and proud community have opened hearts, changed minds, and moved equality forward. And now it is time for us to make history again. And with that, it is my honor to introduce a true champion of equality, a co-sponsor of the Equality Act, a new member of the House, but a longtime ally to the LGBTQ community, the Vice Chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Gay Scanlon from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Thank you all for coming. I'm honored to be standing here with so many advocates who've dedicated their careers and their lives to equality and justice for everyone. We're here because at long last, the Equality Act will be getting the consideration it deserves in the House of Representatives. On Tuesday, the Judiciary Committee, where I serve as Vice Chair, will be holding the first ever hearing on this historic legislation. Community members, policy experts, and advocates have spent countless hours poring over every line of this bill to ensure that it accomplishes its life-saving mission to give legal protections from discrimination to members of the LGBTQ community. We wouldn't be here today without the courage of so many members of that community who've named their discrimination and demanded action. LGBTQ people have experienced fear, hatred, and violence since long before the Compton cafeteria and the Stonewall riots. And the willingness of survivors to speak out is what has finally forced the nation to see the LGBTQ community's barriers to the American dream. The cross-section of participants here today underscores that the Equality Act is a consensus legislation for addressing LGBTQ discrimination, a discrimination that compounds at the intersections of identities. Racial, sexual, and LGBTQ discrimination are not separate, but layer onto each other. The impact of this intersectional discrimination hits transgender women of color the hardest. But in addition, this is personal. It's been personal since my baby sister came out to me nearly 40 years ago. For many people across this country, that's when this fight hits home. Because it doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal, if you come from a big city or you're country born and bred. It gets personal when someone who you love says, "This is who I am." And you know that person and value them, and you'll do whatever you can to make sure that your loved one can live life to the fullest, free from hate, free from discrimination, and free from artificial limits imposed by prejudice. So thank you all for being here today and for your work and courage.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. I'd now like to turn things over to Carter Brown, founder of Black Trans Men, Inc., who will be testifying tomorrow.
Woo, 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 woo.
Hi, I'm Carter Brown, and I'm honored to be here in support of the Equality Act and the thousands of Americans just like me whose livelihood may be dependent upon this amendment to the law passing. Like many Americans, I come from a humble background of generations that had a pattern of living paycheck to paycheck and struggling to keep food on the table. Determined to change my family cycle, I invested my belief in the American dream, that if I pursued my education and secured a good career, I would be able to provide a comfortable living for myself, achieve home ownership, and eventually create a family of my own. Despite many challenges along the way, my efforts were fruitful in that I was the first in my family to get a high school diploma and go on to college. I worked hard and achieved home ownership, and eventually I became a provider for my own family. I built a career in which I made great accomplishments, and it took great pride in my ability to provide a decent living for myself and my family. For me, the American dream had been realized until the day that I arrived in my workplace and was confronted with questions from colleagues about rumors that I was a transgender man. This was followed by personal and offensive questions and comments, office gossip, and a series of discriminatory and harassing interactions from coworkers, managerial staff, and even the Human Resources Department. Being outed as transgender at work caused the loss of friendships from longtime colleagues, loss of respect I'd earned from my impeccable work ethic, and ultimately loss of my job. My termination from work was lawfully justified simply because my home state of Texas has no legal protections against discrimination based on gender identity. Sadly, my story isn't very different from the countless LGBTQ Americans living, working, and contributing in 30 states that do not provide fully inclusive non-discrimination protections. The American dream is broken when all states are not united in rendering basic civil rights and federal protections for all of its citizens to have an opportunity to work hard and earn wages to care for themselves and their families. All Americans need permanent, explicit, non-discrimination laws to be in place and enforced, because the absence of these legal protections not only affect hardworking, transgender, and same-gender loving people, it subsequently affects the livelihood of thousands of American families. I know that our society may not all share the same values, but I believe every person should be valued and have full opportunity to work hard, pursue happiness, and a productive citizenship as an inalienable right. That is why I fully support the Equality Act, because having equal opportunities should not be a matter of sexual orientation or gender. For many people, it is a matter of survival. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, for your work, and your voice, Carter. Next, I'd like to turn things over to Mara Kiesling, Executive Director of the National Center for Transgender Equality.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Congresswoman Scanlon. We really appreciate your being here. Tomorrow, Congress will begin a vital and historic chapter in the transgender community's fight for equality. By listening to experts, advocates, and LGBTQ people ourselves, the House of Representatives will make the case for the Equality Act. Millions of Americans, or majorities of Americans in every state, already support this bill, and nearly 2 million transgender people across the country can tell you why it's necessary. Too many of us are marginalized, denied peace, dignity, and safety, and we are reminded of the tragic consequences of that just this weekend. On Sunday morning, we were heartbroken to learn of the death of Ashanti Carmen, a young black trans woman from Prince George's County, Maryland. According to the police, Ashanti was killed just a few short miles from here, over the line dividing D.C. and Maryland. My heart and the hearts of everyone at NCTE are with Ashanti's family and their community today. Transphobia, homophobia, racism, and violence are often portrayed as intractable problems without clear solutions. And they'll always be with us, and about which there's nothing that can be done. But such shrugging complacency is itself a great evil, and one that can be thwarted by a meaningful, lasting, life-saving action like the Equality Act. The Equality Act is structured to support the foundations of a safe life in our society. We know being unemployed, as 1 in 5 trans people of color are, makes you more susceptible to violence. By sending an unequivocal message that transgender people are full members of this society, entitled to the same dignity, respect, and opportunities as their neighbors, we can erode the deadly stigma that drives this violence. To be sure, no single piece of legislation can end assault and murder against trans people. This is just one part of the work we need to do, but it is a crucial part. What we know of trans people and how many of us are left exposed to bias, prejudice, and ignorance throughout our lives tells us passage of the Equality Act is a necessary step to point our nation in the right direction. While trans people have made much progress in recent years, we know it is fragile. As we mourn Ashanti Carmen today, we as a community should remember the humbling words of Representative John Lewis after the death of Trayvon Martin. He said, "This tragedy is a reminder to all those concerned about justice that we cannot be complacent. There is no door that closes, no wall that is built, no line drawn in the sand that prevents us from going back. The only prevention is us." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mara. Next, I'd like to turn things over to Masen Davis, CEO of Freedom for All Americans.
Thank you so much. My name is Masen Davis, the CEO of Freedom for All Americans, a bipartisan campaign with one ultimate goal: to bring Americans together from all walks of life to finally secure non-discrimination protections for each and every LGBTQ American. Bringing people together to support fairness and equality for LGBTQ people nationwide is more important than ever. At Freedom for All Americans, we're working hard to protect as many people as we can as quickly as possible. That's why we are here today, to urge Congress to pass the Equality Act and protect all LGBTQ Americans from discrimination in their daily lives. Protecting LGBTQ people from discrimination isn't just about policy or politics. It's about building a country and creating a country where every one of us can go about our daily lives without the fear of discrimination or violence, no matter who we love, no matter what we believe, no matter who we are, and no matter where we live. The reality is, discrimination happens to LGBTQ Americans across the country every single day. Millions of our neighbors, friends, and family members are vulnerable because 30 states still lack express and enduring LGBTQ protections. Congress must act now so that all Americans can go about their lives with basic dignity and respect. For me, the struggle for LGBTQ freedom is about people first. I'm a gay transgender man who grew up in a minister's family in rural Missouri. That means I was actually born female, but realized at a young age that wasn't really who I was, long before I even knew the word transgender. I've now lived almost half my life as the man you see before me, and I feel blessed to be able to live in this country as my authentic self. But like many LGBTQ people, growing up was not easy. I've had a lot of hard conversations with a lot of people over the last 20 years, including many who identify as conservative and share my own last name. These conversations and connections were oftentimes challenging, but I found them to be incredibly important and sometimes life-changing. I've witnessed profound transformations in individuals and communities alike by being authentic sharing our stories as LGBTQ people and allies, and by tapping into common values, I know firsthand that we can change hearts and minds. We can bring people together, and we can create a better future for LGBTQ youth and adults alike. The good news is mainstream support and bipartisan momentum for LGBT equality is increasing. Support across the political spectrum has been critical to helping pass new protections in states like New Hampshire, protecting protections in states like Massachusetts, cities like Anchorage, and making important progress in states like Kansas and Virginia and Ohio. Our recent victories and the momentum that's bringing us here today have demonstrated that we win not by highlighting our differences, but by embracing a shared commitment to treating our neighbors with basic dignity and respect. No one should have to face ongoing barriers to who we love, to work hard, and to participate in our communities. LGBTQ people need and deserve protections in every state. You know, I left Missouri decades ago in search of a safe and supportive community and place to live. But fairness and basic protections shouldn't depend on what zip code we call home. And we shouldn't have to leave our homes in order to be ourselves or love who we love. That's why I'm proud to stand beside business leaders, people of faith, LGBTQ people of all ages, races, and ethnicities, and Americans from all walks of life to call for speedy passage of federal protections now. We will not stop until all Americans are free to call their homes, and to be safe where they are. It's time for us to live without discrimination in the communities we love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Masen. I'd now like to turn things over to Kristine Lucius, Executive Vice President for Policy at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, a coalition of more than 200 national organizations working toward an America as good as its ideals. One of those ideals is equal justice under law. And people in this country must be able to live free from discrimination, to express their whole selves and build their families openly without fear of bigotry. The Leadership Conference Coalition has worked on every major civil rights law passed since our founding in 1950. And we are proud to be here fighting for the Equality Act today. This transformative legislation would ensure that LGBTQ people across the country have clear and consistent protections in the public sphere. And the bill would clarify our civil rights laws to strengthen protections for all people, including women, religious groups, and people of color. When our society is more equal, we are all better for it. Right now, LGBTQ people are fighting in courts for recognition of their protection against discrimination in the workplace, in housing, in transit, and in stores. People's civil rights should not be determined by who they are or who they love. I want to thank our partners from the civil rights leaders here with us today, to our friends in Congress, co-sponsoring the legislation, and we are grateful to Congressman Cicilline, Chairman Nadler, Chairman Scott, Chairwoman Waters, and Speaker Pelosi for their steadfast leadership. And finally, we need to raise up every brave person who has shared their very personal story of discrimination and about what this bill would do for them and their families. When we win this fight, it will be because you raised your voices and led us along the path toward a more perfect union. And now we need to tell Congress it's time to pass the Equality Act now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristine. I'd now like to turn things over to someone who needs no introduction, Hilary Shelton, Director of the NAACP Washington Bureau and Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy.
Hello, everyone. As I mentioned, I'm Hilary Shelton, Director of the NAACP's Washington Bureau, and serve as Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy. The NAACP was founded in 1909. We currently have branches and units in every state in the United States, but we're also still on military bases in Italy, Germany, Korea, and Japan. For 110 years, we have struggled for the equality of all Americans, regardless of who they are or what they look like. All Americans. As such, we strongly support and urge swift passage of the Equality Act and urge its immediate enactment. I would especially like to thank Senators Jeff Merkley and Congressman Davis Cicilline for their unyielding advocacy and leadership to help move this very vital legislation to the point we are now. As you all know, the NAACP was instrumental in the signing into law of the seminal Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and enforced desegregation in schools and the right to vote, and required equal access to public places and employment. We believe the same of equal protections that we worked for so hard to secure for the last 110 years must also be extended to all Americans who have experienced discrimination, hate crimes, and profiling, including members of the LGBTQ community. We must include them in the protections as well. As we move forward accordingly, the NAACP has consistently worked so hard to include all of our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ community in our struggles to ensure that laws and policies are carried out fairly and equally. Previously, NAACP support for LGBTQ anti-discrimination protections include the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or ENDA, and the drafting and promulgation of the Affordable Care Act to make sure discrimination regardless of what one calls themselves, what one believes, where that one might very well be from, or who that one very well chooses to love. We will continue to work in support of laws and proposals such as the Equality Act, which will bring an end to this discrimination, period. And I mean period. Until that time, however, we will remain vigilant in our pursuit to ensure that everyone, regardless of what they look like, who their ancestors were, or who they choose to love, is treated the same. To quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. So we must make sure that discrimination in any and all of its forms are eradicated from the very fabric that we call the United States of America. Thank you so very much, and we look forward to passing this very, very important bill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary. I'd now like to introduce Zandra Zuno Baermann, Senior Vice President for Communications and Marketing at Unidos US.
Good afternoon, everyone. Zandra Zuno Baermann, Senior Vice President of Unidos US, formerly known as NCLR. We are the largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the country. We are proud to join our brothers and sisters in the civil rights community in support of the Equality Act, a critical piece of legislation that will add LGBTQ people to existing civil rights laws and strengthen protections for all people, including Latinos. The discrimination limits socioeconomic opportunity, individual freedoms, and harms the social fabric of American society. The Equality Act gives us an opportunity to provide consistent and explicit non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people across areas of employment, housing, credit, education, public spaces, and other facets of life. Let's take advantage of this opportunity. It is 2019, and no one's rights as citizens and residents of this nation should be ignored or violated because of who they are or who they love. It's long time to pass the Equality Act to make sure that LGBTQ people can go to work, raise their families, and live their lives free of discrimination. Queremos igualdad ahora. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zandra. I'd now like to introduce Winnie Stachelberg, Executive Vice President for External Affairs at the Center for American Progress.
I want to thank Congresswoman Scanlon, the Human Rights Campaign, and the Leadership Conference, the NAACP, and so many other incredible advocates who are standing with us today in support of the Equality Act. My name is Winnie Stachelberg, and I work at the Center for American Progress. Tomorrow morning, nearly 45 years since Representative Bella Abzug first introduced the Equality Act into Congress, the House will hold its first ever hearing on this landmark piece of legislation. It will truly be an historic day. Yes, we have made lots of progress, but there is still much more that needs to be done. At tomorrow's hearing, opponents of the Equality Act will try and convince the public that protecting LGBTQ Americans from discrimination will make our country less safe, or that it will prevent certain groups of people from practicing their religious beliefs. These opponents will even try to claim that transgender people don't exist. But if those opponents took one look at this crowd today, they would see an inspiring group of proud transgender Americans. And they would see people of faith who believe that supporting equality and dignity does nothing to diminish their religious convictions. We all understand that a truly moral America is defined by our abiding faith in the values of love, compassion, and our common humanity. We cannot allow a doctor to turn away an infant because she has lesbian parents. We cannot turn a blind eye when a trans woman leaves her longtime job because she is afraid of experiencing discrimination. That is why I am so proud to join people in every corner of our nation, including business leaders, clergy, grassroots activists, and elected officials from across the political spectrum in urging Congress to pass this bipartisan bill. It's a bold and sweeping law that would honor Bella Abzug's legacy. All across the country, LGBTQ Americans desperately need our government to take action, and they need it right now. That's because equality can't wait. Civil rights can't wait. Human rights can't wait. And I promise that I'll keep fighting until we have achieved our mission. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Winnie. I'd now like to introduce Reverend Dr. Dennis Wiley, pastor at Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ, who will be testifying tomorrow.
Good afternoon. My name is Dennis Wiley, pastor emeritus of the Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ here in Washington, D.C., that I, along with my wife, pastored for some 32 years. And during that time of pastoring, we have sought to make our church a beloved community in which all of God's children, regardless of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, ability, national origin, etc., can feel welcomed and feel safe. And to me, it is unconscionable that here we are in approaching the third decade of the 21st century, and we're still trying to make sure that everybody in this so-called land of the free and home of the brave is safe and has the ability to become all that God has created them to become. It is so unfortunate also that the religious community finds itself in far too many instances holding up the other side of the argument. And it seems as though the state often has to lead the way while the church comes kicking and screaming way behind the movement. And so I'm glad to be here today. I will be testifying tomorrow. I'm not going to say too much today, but I just want you to know that I'm happy to be here. I'm supposed to be retired, but here I am. And but I'm never tired of standing for justice. That's right. And standing for equality for all of God's children. So let's hang in there together and let's all make tomorrow a very successful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reverend. I'd now like to introduce Diana Flynn, Litigation Director at Lambda Legal.
Thank you very much, Sarah. My name is Diana Flynn. I am proud to represent Lambda Legal here today, and I'm very happy to state our enthusiastic support for the Equality Act. Many of us have been in the trenches for some time arguing that current law, both federal and state, should protect LGBTQ Americans from discrimination. And we've had great success in making those arguments. But as much success as we've had, it's become more and more clear that we have a long way to go and that more is needed. And what's needed is the Equality Act. There's an appalling level of continuing severe discrimination and harassment against LGBTQ people. And anyone that doubts that, I would simply refer you to our help desk at Lambda Legal. We have literally thousands of calls every single year reporting all sorts of discrimination and harassment in the very areas covered by the Equality Act. It is clear that legislative action is essential. And on top of that, we have a reinvigoration of forces of intolerance and even hate in this country, assisted all too often by the federal administration in power right now, who threaten to roll back the gains that we have made. In fact, our very identities, the very identities of some members of our community are under assault at this point. One thinks that the goal must be to make it so difficult for some of us to exist in public that we return to the shadows. Well, we're not going to return to the shadows. And there are a number of reasons we're not going to return to the shadows. And one is that we have leaders in Congress, like Representative Scanlon, who are standing up for us, just like Congress has done in the past with respect to every minority group which has asserted its rights in the history of this country. Before I came to Lambda Legal, I spent over 30 years at the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and we enforced a number of statutes protecting the rights of all Americans to participate equally in society. From the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to the Voting Rights Act to the Fair Housing Act to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the educational amendments of '72, including Title IX. Well, I'm here to say that the Equality Act is right in that tradition, and it's going to help accomplish for the LGBTQ communities what all of those statutes have helped the rest of us achieve. I thank you all for coming today, and I thank you all for your support of the Equality Act.
Thank you so much, Diana. I'd now like to introduce Angela Ferrell-Zabala, National Director of Strategic Partnerships at Planned Parenthood Federation of America.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Congresswoman Scanlon, and all of the coalition partners here today. My name is Angela Ferrell-Zabala, and I'm here representing Planned Parenthood Federation of America and the 2.4 million patients who come to our health centers every year. Planned Parenthood is proud to provide health care to LGBTQ+ people across the country, including STI testing and treatment, PrEP, PEP, breast and cervical cancer screenings, birth control, hormone therapy, and puberty blockers. Sorry, my paper's here. Equal access to health care is critical, and we know that for too long, LGBTQ communities have been among our nation's most vulnerable. As we approach our 50-year anniversary of Stonewall, there is still currently no federal protections for LGBTQ people in the United States. Individuals are left open to discrimination by healthcare providers. It's unconscionable, and Planned Parenthood is standing with our patients and partners across the movement to help ensure that LGBTQ people have access to safe, affirming, and equal health care. The Equality Act would bring long-needed, clear, and consistent protections for people who face barriers because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. Since day one, the Trump-Pence administration has been working to strip away health care, dignity, and humanity of LGBTQ communities. The Equality Act would push back on the Trump-Pence administration's attempt to block LGBTQ people from health care, including efforts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act's non-discrimination clause and the proposed refusal of care rule, which would give healthcare workers a license to discriminate against LGBTQ patients or patients seeking reproductive health care. We know that LGBTQ people, especially transgender people, experience high rates of discrimination from medical providers. In a 2017 survey, nearly 1/3 of transgender people surveyed said a doctor or healthcare provider refused to treat them due to their gender identity. The Equality Act says no more. It says all people deserve health care. Right. The Equality Act would protect Planned Parenthood's patients, our supporters, our staff, me. LGBTQ+ people are our family, We will never stop fighting for them. Last November, if you remember, voters sent a clear message that they want their elected officials to protect their health care and rights. And the new Congress is taking notice and taking action. This bill is a landmark for LGBTQ communities, and we applaud the bill's champions in Congress and look forward to continuing our work to serve LGBTQ communities. Our goal at Planned Parenthood every day is to make each person who comes through our doors feel welcome, comfortable, and cared for. Because every person, no matter their gender identity, sex, or sexual orientation, deserves the right to health care, free from discrimination. We will not accept anything less. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'd now like to turn things over to Diego Sanchez, Director of Advocacy, Policy, and Partnerships for PFLAG National.
Diego.
Family. Thank you, Congresswoman, so much. My name's Diego Miguel Sanchez, and I'm here today to proudly represent the fierce families of PFLAG. With more than 400 chapters across the U.S., our hundreds of thousands of members and supporters know that all of their loved ones, including LGBTQ loved ones, should be treated fairly and equally. For me, though, this is personal as well as professional. And this is the first time that I will talk about the personal part publicly. It's still painful, raw, and real. Years ago, I served as the Global Vice President of Diversity and Communications at Starwood Hotels and Resorts worldwide. When I overtly disclosed that I was transgender, I was told by my boss, "We can't have people like you, transgender people, working here." That I had just created the company's award-winning, fully inclusive global diversity plan added deep insult to the injury. But due to my disclosure, I suffered direct, explicit workplace discrimination for months. And not too long after, I was fired from my job. My firing placed my family, my mother, at immediate risk. You see, I was the sole provider for my mother at that time, responsible for her health and financial well-being. And the only thing more distressing than having someone take away from me the decades-long career that I loved, solely due to their lack of education and personal discomfort, was having to tell my mom I had been fired. But I made it clear to her I didn't do anything wrong. No kid ever says that, right? I didn't do anything wrong. In fact, I excelled at my job, and I lost my job because of my gender identity. I didn't know how much I could help her to stay alive, to stay housed, to stay well, and to stay fed. And I didn't know how long it would be until I could help her get her life back, which I'd always promised her that I would protect her no matter what, as she, as my mom, had always promised to protect me no matter what. Some have said to me, some people have said to me, "Why did you do anything? Why couldn't you have just shut up?" And my 2 points are, one, have we met? And the other is, how could I have? When I hear the experiences of PFLAGers have had, PFLAGers like PFLAG National Regional Director Amy Adams, whose trans daughter was left unprotected in an active shooter drill at her own school, I know I did the right thing. And there are silver linings. I did create new career paths, and I've served communities and the public well. Mom's last years were peaceful, happy, safe, and loving. Starwood improved after I left. Today, it's part of Marriott Hotels Worldwide, a PFLAG national partner, and clearly an award-winning, inclusive global hospitality leader. Now we need one more silver lining. It's time for Congress to do the right thing, get the Equality Act through the committees to the floor for a vote and passed. I and hundreds of thousands of other PFLAG parents, families, and allies will be fighting in every zip code across the country to get this done, because equality starts with me. Thank you. Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Diego, and your work. I'd now like to introduce Sabrina Joy Stevens, Senior Manager of Campaign and Digital Strategies at the National Women's Law Center.
Sorry, I'm just trying
No
to get this. It's taped pretty well.
Quality control. Let's give him a hand.
Yeah, well.
Okay, it's like taped really well. Sorry, I hate tape.
You are fine. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
All right, hello. I'm Sabrina Joy Stevens with the National Women's Law Center, and I'm here today for many reasons. I'm here because Sunu Chandy, legal director of the NWLC, asked me to be, and I generally try to do things that Sunu Chandy, legal director of the NWLC, asked me to do. But more importantly, I'm here because as a Black bisexual woman, as a wife and mom and stepmom in a multiracial family, and as an advocate dedicated to justice, I know how important the Equality Act is. And not just for the LGBTQ community, for the majority of people living in this country. Not only does the Equality Act make explicit what we've long known, that our federal civil rights laws protect LGBTQ people, it also strengthens civil rights protections for everyone covered by those laws, while ensuring all federal civil rights laws explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. So what does that mean in real-world terms? Well, for example, it means that if a little lady gets overcharged while paying for a car or getting repairs, she'll have federal law on her side. It means if a pharmacist tries to force their beliefs on a woman seeking contraception, she'll have federal law on her side. It means if store employees harass Black and brown teens when they visit the mall, they'll have federal law on their side. It means if a federally funded police department takes gender-based violence less seriously than other crimes, survivors will have federal law on their side. And speaking of survivors, I would be remiss if I didn't address some of the myths being spread by opponents of equality right now. We at the Law Center and so many others are still in the midst of a bruising fight over Title IX, particularly its protections for survivors. So it was news to me to hear that many of the same people who are opposing Title IX right now claim they oppose the Equality Act out of concern for girls' safety and ability to compete in sports. At the National Women's Law Center, we don't buy it. We've been fighting for gender justice since the same year Title IX was put on the books, so we know sex discrimination when we see it. We know that the bias that drives an abused transgender girl out of school and says it's her fault for being different.
Baby boys from genital mutilation? Are we? Am I not a human being?
We know that the same bias, and by the way, that same sexism is at play with this person who also is concerned about something too. We know that the bias that drives an abused transgender girl out of school and says it is her fault for being different is the same bias that punishes a cisgender girl when she reports sexual assault and says it's her fault for being different. Both of these situations are illegal sex discrimination. Both of these situations are wrong, and it is past time for our civil rights laws to explicitly say so. We also know that transgender athletes have been competing in sports for years, reflecting their gender identity with no systemic disadvantage to other athletes. But you know what really does threaten girls' access to sports? Tax scams supported by many of the same people opposing the Equality Act, which rob schools of critical funding for sports and other programs. When education budgets get slashed, athletics and other programs that serve girls, students of color, and queer and transgender youth often face the deepest cuts, threatening all of those students' rights and opportunities. That's why we reject these attempts to divide us, as we reject opponents of equality using transgender people as a scapegoat for problems caused by unjust policymakers. People facing inequality and discrimination on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and religion are the majority of people in this country. Yet for too many of us, our legal protections can change as we move from state to state and even city to city. It is long past time for our laws to explicitly protect all of us, no matter where we live, work, and play. It's time to ensure that the Equality Act finally becomes law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for those wonderful remarks. I'd now like to turn things over to Ann Thompson, Senior Legislative Representative at the ACLU.
Thank you, Sarah.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here today with so many fellow advocates for justice to stand in strong support of the Equality Act. For the ACLU, as an organization that represents people who have experienced discrimination simply because of who they are, we know why this legislation is so important and necessary. Discrimination robs individuals of their education, employment, housing, even their very liberty. The Equality Act is needed for people like Megan Taylor, a black trans woman who was arrested and spent over a week in jail after staff at a hotel that she was staying at on her way to a funeral called police because they suspected Megan and her friend who was traveling with her were engaged in prostitution because they were, quote, men dressed like women, unquote. There was no evidence of prostitution, and Megan was never charged with it. The Equality Act is needed for people like Gavin Grimm, now a 19-year-old young man who is trans, who was segregated from his peers throughout high school by being forced to use separate restrooms that no other student at his school was required to use. Even though Gavin has since graduated, his school continues to discriminate against him to this very day by refusing to update his official transcript to accurately reflect who he is. As a result, every time Gavin is required to provide a copy of his transcript to a college or potential employer, he must provide one that misgenders him. The Equality Act is needed for people like Andre Cooley, a black gay man who was fired from his job as a corrections officer after his supervisors learned of his sexual orientation, after Andre called 911 when his then boyfriend became physically violent. When Andre asked if he was being fired because he was gay, he was told yes. The Equality Act is needed for people like Dave Mullins and Charlie Craig, a gay couple who experienced the sting and humiliation of discrimination when trying to order a cake for their upcoming wedding, only to be told by the bakery's owner that he wouldn't sell such cakes to same-sex couples. The Equality Act is also needed for people across the country who every single day experience discrimination for shopping while black, or flying while brown, or trying to hail a taxi while black or brown. It is needed for women who are routinely charged more by mechanics than men for the same car services. The need for consistent, explicit, and nationwide civil rights protections for LGBTQ people could not be clearer. This year, as we mark the 50th anniversary of the uprising at Stonewall, members of Congress can write the next chapter in our nation's civil rights history by passing the Equality Act, and we urge them to do exactly that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. And for our final speaker, I'd like to introduce Naomi Washington-Leapheart, Faith Work Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force.
All right.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart. I am the Faith Work Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. I am Black. I am a woman. I am bisexual. I am married by law and by covenant to another Black woman. And we are mothering our preteen daughter with pride. Amen. I am also an ordained Christian minister. I preach and teach and journey spiritually with people all over this country. Yesterday was Transgender Day of Visibility. Trans people all over the globe courageously lifted up their voices, insisting that we see them, that we hear their stories, that we stand with them, that we struggle with them, that we respect their right to live and live abundantly. But I'm heartbroken this afternoon. I'm angry this afternoon because today, like so many of you, I read the news report that Ashanti Carmen, a 27-year-old Black trans woman, was killed over the weekend just 15-20 minutes from here over the DC city line. As I was reading, as I was looking at Ashanti's smiling face in all of the pictures, I imagined her life. Ashanti had dreams. She had hopes. She had love. She had family. She had friends. She was visible, but she was not protected. She was cherished to those in her private life, but she was vulnerable in public. And today, all LGBTQ people are vulnerable in public. We are always and already here among us, in our midst, seen and heard because we insist on it, but we remain invisible in ways that endanger our very lives, in ways that undermine our dignity. I stand here as a queer Christian leader to declare that LGBTQ people need and deserve full protection under the law for our full selves all the time. As a minister, as a person of moral courage, I believe that Ashanti was God's beloved. She was covered in full by the love of the one who created her. But the violence that stole her life was made possible because our country has not fully committed to ensuring that LGBTQ people are protected and dignified by federal law. The time is now for the Equality Act, legislation that preserves the dignity of all LGBTQ people, preserves the right for women like Ashanti to experience full and abundant life. And I'm not alone in this proclamation. More than 40 national faith organizations support the Equality Act. It has been suggested that LGBTQ people are impediments to the freedom of religion. I reject that characterization. I declare today that LGBTQ people are not the enemies of religious freedom. No, indeed, we are people of faith ourselves. We are faith leaders ourselves. We too have an interest in the preservation of religious liberty. We want religious liberty to be protected, but not so that our faithfulness can become the only right way to be faithful, but so that people can continue to live into their beliefs, like the majority of Americans, that all people, including LGBTQ people, should be free to be who they are, wherever they are, all the time. You know, I'm a preacher, and so that means that I commit to every time I speak giving some good news.
All right, let's hear the gospel.
So here's the good news. My faith and the faith of so many people in the United States compels me to be more open, more compassionate, more benevolent. And that's why we are so committed to supporting the Equality Act. I want a world where other LGBTQ people can create families without fear of discrimination. I want a world where genderqueer and trans students can go to school without harassment, without exclusion. I want a world where couples like me and my wife can do business without harm or rejection. The good news is we have what it takes. We have the political will as we follow the leadership of people like Congresswoman Scanlon. We have what it takes. We have strong and diverse coalitions like the one represented behind me. We have what it takes. We have history on our side. We have moral courage on our side. We got what it takes. So let's get it done. Let's protect all of us all the time by supporting the Equality Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. To close out, I want to thank once again Representative Scanlon for your leadership, for helping to bring us all together. We are so lucky to not just have you on the House Judiciary Committee, but to have you in the majority on the House Judiciary Committee ahead of tomorrow. I also want to thank House leadership for making the Equality Act a priority, Representative Cicilline and Senator Merkley for their leadership on the Equality Act. I want to thank all of these incredible civil rights and human rights leaders behind me who have joined us with us today. Your words are moving. I know it means so much to the LGBTQ community that we have this diverse and historic coalition behind the Equality Act. This is what solidarity looks like.
That's right.
And with this solidarity, with the good news that Naomi left us with, we will make history tomorrow and make history in the months and years to come. Thank you all for joining us. Any press that'd like to ask any questions will be around.